In December 1916, a group of Russian noblemen gathered in a palace basement to kill a man they believed was destroying their empire. They had poison. They had guns. They had 5 of them against 1 of him. They had planned it carefully, and they had every reason to believe it would be straightforward. A man comes in. You poison him. He dies. You drop the body in the river. Russia is saved. What happened instead over the next several hours became one of the most extraordinary and disputed nights in the history of modern Europe. A night that produced accounts so extreme, so contradictory, and so operatically violent that historians are still arguing about what actually happened more than a century later. A night that ended with a body beneath the frozen Neva River. And a night that, as it turned out, saved nothing and nobody. Because the men in that basement had misunderstood something fundamental about the situation they were in. They believed that the crisis threatening Russia had a name and a face and a peasant body that could be disposed of in a river. They were wrong. The crisis was not one man. It was a dynasty in its final collapse, a war it could not win, a society it had refused to reform, and an empire whose foundations had been crumbling for decades before a Siberian mystic with unusual eyes had ever stepped inside the Winter Palace. Killing Rasputin did not save Russia. It simply meant that the men who killed him had a front row seat to everything that followed. This is the complete story of Grigory Rasputin. From a Siberian village to the inner sanctum of the most powerful royal family in the world. Through one of the most bizarre and contested assassinations in history, and into the collapse of an empire that came just 2 months after his body was pulled from the ice. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 22, 1869, in the village of Pokrovskoye, a settlement on the Tura River in the vast flatness of western Siberia. He was born into a peasant farming family, the son of Yefim Rasputin, a farmer and church elder who worked as a government courier to supplement the family income. His childhood is almost entirely undocumented in reliable sources. What is known is that he grew up in a world defined by the Orthodox faith, the rhythms of agricultural life, and the specific character of Siberian peasant culture, which combined deep religiosity with certain earthiness and directness that the aristocrats who would later encounter him found either compelling or profoundly uncomfortable, depending on who they were and what they needed from him. Around 1892, when he was in his early 20s and already married with children, Rasputin underwent a religious experience at a monastery that changed the direction of his life. He became consumed by spiritual questions. He began a series of religious pilgrimages across Russia, walking enormous distances to visit monasteries and holy sites, living on charity and prayer, developing along the way the reputation as a wandering holy man that would eventually carry him to St. Petersburg and into the pages of history. He was not a monk. Despite his famous nickname, the Mad Monk, Rasputin was never ordained. He was a strannik, a wandering pilgrim, a figure who existed in Russian religious culture outside the formal structures of the church and who carried a different kind of spiritual authority, the authority of personal charisma, of apparent direct connection to the divine, of the holy fool tradition that Russian Orthodoxy had always made space for. He could be crude. He drank. He had a sexual appetite that produced scandals wherever he went. And he also had something that the people who became devoted to him described consistently across years and continents as an almost physical force of personality. Something in the eyes. Something in the presence. Something that made people in the same room feel seen and known and somehow larger than themselves. He arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903. The city was the capital of the Romanov Empire, one of the largest and most powerful states in the world, ruled by Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, a German princess who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy and thrown herself into it with a particular fervor of the convert. Nicholas and Alexandra had 4 daughters and 1 son. The son, Alexei, born in 1904, was the heir to the Romanov throne and the center of everything his mother's emotional world revolved around. He was also a hemophiliac. Hemophilia is a genetic condition in which the blood's ability to clot is severely impaired. In 1904, it was essentially untreatable. A minor cut or bruise could produce internal bleeding that was dangerous and excruciating. A serious injury could be fatal. Alexandra had passed the gene to Alexei in the way that the descendants of Queen Victoria across several European royal families had inherited it, through a genetic line that had moved from Britain to Germany to Russia through the marriages of the 19th century. Alexei's condition was kept as secret as possible because the heir's vulnerability was a state security concern, but Alexandra knew, and the knowledge was slowly destroying her. She had consulted doctors. She had prayed. She had sought spiritual advisors. Nothing gave her more than temporary relief from the terror of watching her son suffer and knowing that any day a fall or a cut could trigger a bleeding episode that might kill him. In 1905, a senior member of the Russian royal family arranged for Rasputin to be introduced to Nicholas and Alexandra. Nicholas recorded the meeting in his diary with characteristic understatement, describing a man who had brought him an icon and with whom he had had a very good talk. Alexandra's reaction was different in kind. Rasputin was brought to Alexei's bedside during a bleeding episode. By the accounts of everyone present, Alexei's condition improved. The bleeding slowed. The child calmed. Whether Rasputin possessed any supernatural healing ability is a question that modern historians approach from a different angle from the one that was used in 1905. The most widely accepted explanation for his apparent effect on Alexei involves two mechanisms. First, Rasputin told Alexandra to keep the doctors away, specifically to stop them administering aspirin, which was at that time considered a universal remedy and was given for the pain of hemophiliac bleeding episodes without anyone understanding that aspirin thins the blood and would significantly worsen exactly the condition it was being given to treat. By stopping the aspirin, Rasputin inadvertently stopped one of the main things that was making Alexei worse. Second, historians including Douglas Smith, author of the most comprehensive modern biography of Rasputin, have noted that the calming atmosphere Rasputin created around the child, the reduction of Alexandra's visible panic, the creation of a sense that things were under control, had real physiological effects on a condition that is significantly worsened by stress and anxiety. None of this requires mysticism. All of it is comprehensible through normal human psychology and the specific irony of a faith healer accidentally improving a patient's condition by removing one of the things that was harming him. But in 1905, in the world Alexandra inhabited, it looked like a miracle. And after the first miracle, there was another, and then another, and by the time Alexandra's attachment to Rasputin had become the defining feature of the Romanov court's private life, she was beyond the reach of any argument that he was anything other than what she believed him to be. A man of God sent to protect her son, and through him the dynasty. Nicholas was more ambivalent about Rasputin than Alexandra, but deferred to her on the matter because he understood what the man's presence meant to her stability. And Alexandra's stability was, in the specific domestic emotional economy of their marriage, something that Nicholas valued very highly. He was a devoted husband in the way that constitutionally weak men are sometimes devoted, with a completeness that made him unable to draw the boundaries that the situation required. Outside the palace, Rasputin's reputation was a catastrophe. In St. Petersburg's drawing rooms, in the Duma where Russia's parliament met, in the offices of the church hierarchy, in the newspapers that were allowed to discuss him obliquely under the censorship of the time, Rasputin was becoming the symbol of everything that was wrong with the Romanov court. He drank publicly and heavily. He was seen in restaurants in a state that was incompatible with the image of a holy man. He had sexual relationships with women who came to him for spiritual guidance. He boasted of his access to the royal family in ways that made the aristocracy furious and the church alarmed. He was, to the Russian elite, a peasant who had somehow inserted himself into the inner sanctum of their empire and who was being protected from every attempt to remove him by an empress who would not hear a word against him. The rumors went further. There was talk of an affair between Rasputin and Alexandra, a claim that almost every serious historian who has examined the evidence dismisses as almost certainly untrue, but that circulated so widely and so persistently that it became part of the public image of the Romanov court regardless of its factual basis. There were pamphlets. There were caricatures. There were conversations in which the word Rasputin was enough to convey the full weight of a dynasty's illegitimacy. And then the war came. In August 1914, Russia entered the First World War. The country was spectacularly unprepared. Its military was vast but poorly equipped, poorly led, and dependent on a logistics infrastructure that was inadequate for the scale of the conflict it was being asked to fight. By 1915, Russian casualties were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead. The army was running out of ammunition. Soldiers were being sent to the front with one rifle between two men, told to take the second one from a fallen comrade when available. In September 1915, Nicholas made the decision to take personal command of the Russian armies at the front. It was, from a strategic standpoint, a catastrophic mistake. Not because Nicholas was an incompetent military commander, though he was not a gifted one, but because the decision to place himself at the head of the army meant that from this point forward, every Russian military failure was personally his failure. There was no longer a general to blame. There was only the Tsar. And while Nicholas was at the front, Alexandra was in Petrograd running the government with Rasputin beside her. This is not a metaphor. Alexandra was genuinely involved in governmental decision-making during this period. She wrote to Nicholas constantly, passing along Rasputin's views on ministerial appointments, on policy decisions, on the management of the war. Ministers were appointed and dismissed on the basis of whether Rasputin approved of them. Competent officials were removed because they had expressed skepticism about the holy man. Incompetent ones were retained because they had cultivated his favor. The governmental machinery of one of the world's largest empires was being run partly on the basis of the opinions of a Siberian peasant who had no formal education and no official position, and who the empress believed was in direct communication with God. The result was a government that was, in the specific language of the time, a disaster. Vladimir Purushkevich, a far-right member of the Duma and one of the men who would eventually help kill Rasputin, stood before the parliament in November 1916 and said publicly what many had been saying privately for years. He described the Tsar's ministers as marionettes whose strings were held firmly by Rasputin and the Empress. He said Alexandra had remained a German on the Russian throne and alien to the country and its people. He said the empire was being destroyed from within. By December 1916, a group of high-ranking aristocrats had decided that the destruction had to stop and that the only way to stop it was to remove the man at its center. The group that formed around Prince Felix Yusupov had several things in common. They were all connected to the highest levels of Russian aristocratic society. They all believed, with varying degrees of sophistication, that killing Rasputin would somehow stabilize the Romanov dynasty and preserve the empire from the revolution that was increasingly visibly coming. And they had all, in the specific way of men who plan violent actions from a position of privilege, underestimated almost everything about what they were about to attempt. Yusupov was one of the wealthiest men in Russia, heir to a fortune that made the Romanovs look modest. He was 29 years old in December 1916, charming and sophisticated, and possessed of the particular vanity that comes with having never wanted for anything. He had been cultivating a relationship with Rasputin for several weeks before the assassination, visiting him under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance for health problems, building enough of a connection that Rasputin would agree to come to the Yusupov palace when invited. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was the Tsar's first cousin, 24 years old, and one of Nicholas's favorite relatives. Vladimir Purushkevich, the Duma member who had given the public speech against Rasputin, was also part of the group, along with a military doctor named Stanislav Delazevert and a captain named Sukotin. 5 men. Yusupov's Moika Palace as the location. The night of December 29th to 30th, 1916. The plan was to lure Rasputin to the palace basement and poison him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine. What actually happened in that basement is the subject of one of history's most persistently contested accounts, and the reason for the contest is important to understand. The primary source for the dramatic version of events, the version involving Rasputin consuming large quantities of cyanide and showing no effect, then being shot and getting up and running into the courtyard, then being shot again, then being beaten, then being thrown bound into the river still alive, is Felix Yusupov himself. Yusupov told this story. He published it in 1927, a decade after the events, in a book that he wrote partly to generate income after losing his fortune in the revolution. He was, by his own account, a man with a gift for performance and a taste for drama. He had also spent the decades since the assassination watching the legend of Rasputin grow into something almost mythological and had every incentive to position himself at the center of a story that was already extraordinary. Modern historians, including Douglas Smith, whose 2016 biography of Rasputin is the most rigorously researched account of his life, have concluded that the poison story is almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated. The man who was supposed to supply the cyanide later wrote that he had a crisis of conscience and replaced it with crushed aspirin. If what was actually in those cakes was aspirin, the fact that Rasputin consumed it and felt no immediate dramatic effects is entirely unsurprising. He may simply have eaten some slightly odd-tasting food and felt fine. What the physical and forensic evidence does support is that Rasputin was shot. His body, when recovered from the river, showed 3 gunshot wounds. 1 to the midsection, 1 to the back, 1 to the forehead, which was described in contemporaneous accounts as a contact shot, a gun placed directly against the skin and fired, the kind of shot that in the operational language of the time was called a control shot, and whose purpose was to ensure that a target who might still be alive was definitively not. The autopsy's findings regarding the cause of death have been disputed over the years, with some accounts suggesting water in the lungs indicating he was still alive when thrown into the river, and others arguing the evidence does not support this conclusion. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. Rasputin arrived at the Yusupov Palace basement in the late hours of December 29th. He was shot at least once in the basement by Yusupov. He was shot again outside, possibly while trying to escape, by Purishkevich. He was bound and dropped through a hole in the ice into the Neva River. His body was recovered by investigators several days later. The elements of the story that made Rasputin appear essentially unkillable, the massive quantities of cyanide that produced no effect, the multiple fatal wounds he survived, the miraculous recovery from death that allowed him to escape into the courtyard, are the elements that Yusupov had the most obvious motivation to embellish. A man who survived poison and multiple gunshots before being drowned in a frozen river is a monster, a supernatural creature, a figure worthy of the legendary reputation his killer wanted to claim credit for eliminating. A man who ate some aspirin-laced cake and was shot twice and dropped in a river is just a man who was murdered by aristocrats who were better armed than he was. The distinction matters because the myth of Rasputin's near immortality has shaped how his story has been understood and retold for more than a century, and that myth serves Yusupov's reputation far more than it serves historical accuracy. When the body was pulled from the river, the Romanov dynasty had 2 months left. Nicholas did not punish the killers severely. He sent Yusupov into internal exile on his estate. He sent Dmitry Pavlovich to the Persian front. Neither consequence was remotely proportionate to participation in a murder, and both reflected the political reality that Nicholas was dealing with. The killers were members of his own family circle. The person they had killed was widely and intensely hated. Executing or imprisoning a Grand Duke for murdering a peasant would have added to the sense of a monarchy in terminal crisis rather than resolving anything. In February 1917, the revolution that the killing of Rasputin was supposed to prevent arrived anyway. The Tsar abdicated in March. The Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years was over. Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children were placed under house arrest, moved between locations as the political situation deteriorated, and eventually transported to a house in Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, they were taken to the basement of that house and shot by a Bolshevik firing squad. Alexei, the hemophiliac boy whose suffering had brought Rasputin into the palace, was 17 years old. The conspirators who had believed they could save Russia by removing one man scattered in the revolution's wake. Yusupov and his wife fled Russia and eventually settled in Paris, where they lived in genteel exile, spending down the remnants of their fortune and supplementing it with Yusupov's writings about the assassination. He sued MGM Studios in the 1930s over a film that depicted a thinly fictionalized version of his wife's relationship with Rasputin and won a settlement that kept them financially solvent for years. He lived until 1967. Purishkevich died of typhus in 1920. Dmitry Pavlovich died in Switzerland in 1942. Rasputin's daughters had tried to stop him going out on the night of December 16th. Maria and Varvara, his teenage daughters who lived with him in Petrograd, had heard rumors of death threats and had hidden his galoshes to prevent him from leaving the apartment. He found them. He went anyway. Maria fled Russia after the revolution and worked as a dancer and circus performer in Europe before immigrating to the United States, where she lived until 1977. She outlived her father by 61 years. Before he died, Rasputin had written a letter to the Tsar that has become one of the most discussed documents in the whole mythology surrounding him. In it, he wrote that if he were to be killed by common peasants, the Tsar would have nothing to fear and would rule Russia long. But if he were killed by nobles, if the Russian nobility spilled his blood, then their hands would remain stained with it for 25 years, and they would not be able to wash it off. He wrote that nobles would flee Russia, that the Tsar would be killed, that Russia would be shaken, and the people would be torn apart. Whether Rasputin wrote this before or after he knew of the specific plot against him, and whether the letter was a genuine prophecy or a calculated piece of self-protection designed to make his killers afraid of the consequences, is impossible to determine. What can be said is that he was right about the outcome, even if the mechanism he described was not supernatural, but simply the logical result of a dynasty that had already been collapsing for decades, and that a Siberian peasant's death in a palace basement was never going to halt. The revolution came. The Tsar was killed. The nobles fled. Russia was torn apart. The mad monk, who was neither mad nor a monk, did not cause any of those things. But he had been present at the center of the final years of the dynasty that they destroyed. And the story of how a Siberian peasant walked from the absolute margins of Russian society to the private rooms of the Winter Palace, and what he found there, and what the people who feared him did to try to stop him, and why none of it was ever going to be enough to save what was already ending, is a story about the specific fragility of power dressed up in ceremony and authority when the ground beneath it is giving way. The hole in the ice closed over the river on the morning of December 30th, 1916. The empire that the men who made that hole had been trying to save had 6 weeks left. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you find most extraordinary about this story. Tell me whether you think killing Rasputin had any effect on what happened to Russia in 1917. Tell me what you think the legend of his near-immortal death says about the people who told it and the world that believed it. And subscribe right now so you never miss what comes next. Because Russian history in this period is full of stories like this one. Extraordinary people in an extraordinary moment who changed nothing and lost everything. And they deserve to be told properly.